Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore, part 2 of Enriching Your Personal Philosophy, or the Well-Examined Life. And here, just like in episode 1, we're going to look at a number of different potential philosophies that do not replace Masonry, but may flesh out elements of it. They may take that beautiful drawing that we have on our trestle board and add color and ornamentation, detail that may otherwise be missing from Masonry, questions that we don't necessarily answer. And we know that Masonry is a system of morality. It teaches us to subdue our passions and become better men. Here I want to look at what it has meant to be a better man to other societies. Now, this is usually the realm of philosophy, looking at morals and ethics, and I discussed a little bit last time why that is. Why in so many ancient societies this is happening in philosophy rather than anywhere else. Now, today I'm going to be looking at some Eastern philosophies. Now, in the West, Taoism or Buddhism can be seen as religions, but the truth is far more nuanced. A lot of times scholars will look at these two ideas, Buddhism and Taoism, as philosophy as much as anything else. So Buddhism, as taught by the Buddha, sort of old teaching Buddhism, and Taoism are very philosophical. When you examine them, there are no supreme beings. There's no looking at specific goals. Now, these things will exist down the line, supreme beings in Buddhism and different forms of Buddhism that evolve 500 years after the Buddha's existence, and I'm not looking at that. But we're looking at as philosophy. To many scholars, this places them firmly in the philosophical camp when it comes to their teachings. I'm going to treat them accordingly in this case. We're also going to look at existentialism. So last time we focused on the West and the classical world. Today I want to look at a couple of Eastern philosophies as well as what more modern philosophy would say about life. And philosophy takes a big shift in the 19th century. I do not expect that you will adopt any of these philosophies in their entirety. What I hope is that you can take from them elements that can enrich your life and assist you in your Masonic journey. So, first, let's introduce Eastern philosophy. Now, Eastern philosophy, Eastern religion doesn't work quite the same as it does in the West. In China, it's not uncommon for people to believe in Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism simultaneously, along with other local Chinese beliefs. Similarly, if you're in Japan, you might be Shinto and follow Zen Buddhist beliefs. These are often held together. When most people think of Eastern philosophy, they picture monks sitting in a lotus position and chanting, and there's some truth to that stereotype. It does exist within the monastery system, but that isn't everyone. The East is also home to a vast and diverse range of philosophical thought, and they all can offer us tremendously insightful ideas about how to live a better life. And interestingly, in terms of dates, Taoism and Buddhism develop within about 50 years of each other, a little before 500 BCE, so about 150 years before we start seeing Socrates and others in ancient Greece. When I said that this is all happening in a very short time frame, that's what's happening here. We have, from the beginnings of Buddhism and Lao Tzu, Taoism is about 550. We hit Socrates sometime around 450, so about 100 years later. And then we come into the latest of them that we hit, Zeno and the Stoics, at around 300. So this very short time frame has an incredible explosion of philosophy. And the Greeks are aware of what's happening in Asia. The Asians are aware of what's happening in Greece. How? The Silk Road, or Silk Roads, really, these trade routes that exist across Eurasia and had existed since prior to 500 BCE. So the Greeks will write about groups of Buddhist monks coming to them. There are Greek Buddhist monks who will travel to Sri Lanka. The Greeks will also invade Eurasia under Alexander the Great. They get all the way to the Indus Valley, and then another king by the name of Menander will actually invade India and bring Greek influence into India, into Buddhism. In fact, that's why we see a tradition of depicting the Buddha as human in Buddhism. It comes from the Greeks. So my point is, these are all very, very interconnected. Now, there are several Eastern philosophical concepts that we can apply to our lives. They're pretty common throughout various Eastern philosophies, and many of these are common in the West as well. For example, the power of now, being in the present. One of the most fundamental ideas in Eastern philosophy is that of living in the present moment. It's not about forgetting our past or our future, but focusing our attention on the here and now. By living in the present, we can more fully appreciate the beauty of life and all it has to offer. True happiness comes from savoring the simple joys of life, very Epicurean. The warmth of a sunny day, the taste of a delicious meal, and the laughter of a loved one. So next time you find your mind wandering, take a deep breath and bring your attention back to the present. There's also the importance of balance, which we see in Masonry, we see in various Greek philosophies, this idea of interconnection. It's at the heart of Eastern philosophy. The belief is that everything in the universe is interconnected and interdependent, very much like the Force. This means every action we take affects everything else. As a result, it is essential to maintain a sense of balance in our lives and to follow the right path. The Greeks would say the path of virtue, which is effectively what they're going to do here as well. There's the wisdom of letting go. One of the most difficult things to do in life is letting go of attachments. And this could be attachments, resentments, ideas, biases. You get the picture. The idea of letting go is a central tenet of many Eastern philosophies, and it's something that is incredibly wise. In particular, their emphasis on the importance of detachment from material possessions, although again, it goes broader than that. The thinking is that attachment to things leads to feelings of jealousy, resentment, and greed. Instead, one should focus on inner happiness and contentment. In a lot of Eastern faiths, you're looking inward as much as you're looking outward. So outward would be virtue, inward would be self-reflection. Now, in Eastern faiths, we see meditation. Meditation, by the way, is something that the Stoics would practice as well, so we do see it in the West. In Asian philosophy, meditation is often considered an essential tool for spiritual growth. The practice of meditation helps to still the mind, unify the body and the breathing, and open up a connection to deeper levels of consciousness. In addition, meditation helps develop focus and concentration, things that are essential for spiritual progression. And it's very useful. You could read this as self-reflection, the same reflection that Socrates is talking about. Same principle, different name. Then there's the significance of detachment. Again, getting at that idea of letting go. A little bit nuanced here. Eastern philosophies believe that attachment to things is the root of all suffering, and detachment is often seen as a virtue. Because by detachment from the material world, we can be freed from the cycle of suffering and achieve a state of inner peace. Here, focusing on detaching from all those things that aren't really important. It doesn't mean you don't have an attachment to the people around you, etc. What it means is recognizing when to let go, recognizing that detachment is important, especially if you want an objective viewpoint in those meditations, in your self-development. The force of compassion. In many Eastern philosophies, compassion is seen as a powerful force that can help to heal the world and transform lives. In all of these philosophies, compassion is seen as a vital quality that can help bring about positive change in the world. This is the outward focus. This is their answer to sort of virtue would be broadly compassion. The belief is that by feeling compassion from others, we open ourselves to the potential for change and growth. The impact of simplicity is the last commonality I'm going to look at. And here, looking at this idea of a world that is constantly moving and changing, it can be very easy to get caught up in the complexity of everyday life. It's challenging to slow down and appreciate the simple things in life, and to recognize when we can set aside those complications and leave them for something else or someone else. But in a complicated and uncertain world, simplicity is a powerful tool to help us find our way. A life filled with clutter and excess is hard to manage and can lead to frustration and overwhelm. It brings to mind ideas of Diogenes the Cynic, famous man in Athens who famously owned a bowl and would talk about the importance of simplicity, because if all he has is a bowl, imagine how little housework he has to do. He also lives in a barrel and pees on people who he disagrees with. Leaving those things aside, it is an interesting idea. The less you have, the less complex your life would be. Imagine if you didn't have a car, so you didn't have to maintain it and worry about oil changes and everything else. Or you lived in a smaller space, and so it only took an hour a week to clean it. When you simplify your life, you make space for what is meaningful and focus on the present. This allows you to live a more peaceful, arguably more fulfilling life. So let's start with our philosophies. I want to start with Buddhism, which is all about ending suffering. Not just your suffering, but suffering for the world around you, depending on which tradition you follow. But many of the early traditions would be about ending suffering for your fellow being as well as for yourself. Centuries before the therapeutic philosophical approaches of Epicureanism and Stoicism, about 250 years earlier, the Buddha was sharing his recommendations for how we can see the world clearly, banish suffering, and live a good life. Buddhism is a philosophical tradition based on the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, a prince who lived in ancient India around 550-500 BCE. The historical Buddha is this prince who became the Buddha when he achieves enlightenment. And it goes a little bit further. What happens is he is given this amazing princely life. His father doesn't want him to see suffering, and so he doesn't until he's about 29 or 30, somewhere in there. And he goes out on a series of trips. He sees suffering, he sees aging, he sees illness, he sees death. And he recognizes this suffering, and he decides that he wants to find a way to end suffering. So he goes off and joins a bunch of ascetics, in other words, hermits, people living off in the woods, and all they're doing is meditating, and they believe that if they remove all of sort of the pleasures of life, that they can find enlightenment or some form of it. And he does this for about 6 years, to the point where he can feel his spine through his belly. We're told he's subsisting on a single grain of rice per day. But this is where enlightenment comes in. At one point, a child comes to him and offers him this sort of rice pudding or rice dish. And he says, oh, okay, I'll eat that. This is very much not an ascetic sort of thing to do. But he figured that he has nothing to lose. He hasn't found his answers in this hermetic, this ascetic life. And he eats it, and then he sits under the Bodhi tree and finds enlightenment, thus giving us this concept of what's called the middle way. In other words, you should not, and this is balance, you should not be too decadent, you shouldn't be too hedonistic, but at the same time, he argues that you should not be too austere. You should not oversimplify. You should take care of your physical form, for example, and not let it break down. Because if you do, then, well, things aren't going to work out. Now, rather than persuade us to believe in anything in particular, the Buddha focuses on one subject, teaching how to alleviate suffering. Really, dukkha is the word that's used, and this is a Pali word often translated as suffering, but perhaps it's stronger than that, intended to capture all of life's dissatisfactions, disappointment, unfulfilled hopes, and unhappiness. So he's focusing on this idea of suffering. And one of the interesting things about Buddhism is he's constantly telling his students, go out and question me. Go out and, have no problem in hearing what other people have to say. And he acknowledges that there isn't one way to find enlightenment, to end suffering. There are many ways. It's really open to interpretation. So he's not persuading us in this one specific thing. Indeed, while the ancient Greeks broadly saw the goal of life as eudaimonia, excellence and happiness, Buddhists think the purpose of life is enlightenment, seeing the world as it really is, and thus freeing ourselves from suffering. Oftentimes, they believe that this happens within the monastic tradition, in other words, as Buddhist monks, separated from the world, whereas Stoicism looks at the same basic principle, but says you can't just hide away from the world, you have to be part of it. You have to be able to function in society. So Buddhists think the purpose of life is enlightenment, seeing the world as it really is. The Buddha packages his core teachings in 4 noble truths, which are summarized as follows. There is suffering, noble truth 1. Number 2, suffering has a cause. Well, that means there must be number 3, because if there's a cause, that means that we could potentially eliminate that cause, which is the 3rd noble truth. And the 4th is that there is a path to eliminating suffering, known as the Eightfold Path. Suffering, to him, ultimately springs from desire or craving. In other words, if you just appreciated the things that you have and you didn't crave the 85-inch TV, then you would have less suffering. And he believes that this arises from a fundamental mismatch between our worldview and how things really are. By the way, sounds a lot like the Stoics, that filter, that judgment that we carry. 3 concepts are central to the Buddha's teachings here. Suffering, but then impermanence, in other words, the idea that everything must end. By the way, the Stoics have a very similar idea. And the idea that there is no persisting self or soul. This idea that you can't find the soul anywhere. It's almost like a bubbling pot. Each of us are one of those bubbles. We exist for a period of time, and then according to the Buddha, we just fall back into this sort of universal energy. It is by truly internalizing these marks of existence that we can, through the Eightfold Path, see reality clearly and achieve enlightenment. As the Buddha puts it in his first sermon, the setting in motion of the wheel of teaching, there is a path that leads to the cessation of suffering. It is indeed the Noble Eightfold Path, which includes right views. In other words, removing those filters and biases from our thought patterns. Right intentions, making sure we're doing things for the correct purpose. We're not helping someone to get credit, but rather helping them just to alleviate suffering. Right speech, recognizing that our words mean things and can harm people, and we must take the time to use the correct words. Right actions, making sure that we're doing the right thing. Right livelihood. In other words, you need to pick a career that isn't taking advantage of people, that isn't doing something that is inappropriate or what we would see as immoral today. Right effort, that you concentrate on the things that are going to help alleviate suffering, that are going to help the people around you. Right mindfulness. Now right mindfulness is a little bit different from right intention. Right mindfulness means that you are existing in the present, that you are recognizing things in the present. You aren't reacting to them based on what you think might happen in the future, because we're really lousy fortune tellers. And right concentration, very similar to right effort. The idea that you need to make sure that when you apply yourself, you're applying yourself to the right things. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Buddhist philosophy, you might like some of the following readings. There's the Buddhist doctrine of no self, why you do not exist. There's the Buddha on ending suffering, the parable of the poisoned arrow. Probably the easiest one as a primer to Buddhism, if you get the chance, is Buddhism for Dummies by Jonathan Landau. Great book. I just recently listened to it on Audible. Fantastic read. Really good primer, and then a good jumping off point if you want to pursue those ideas. Now we also have Taoism, and Taoism is about going with the flow. It's an ancient philosophy whose teachings are still valid in today's world, very prominent in China. For starters, this philosophy teaches three important lessons: simplicity, compassion, and patience. Simplicity, in that you should accept what you have and don't worry about what you don't or what you want. Compassion, or virtue, in other words, looking outside yourself. And patience, being aware that sometimes things just take time. It advises us to be simple in thinking and simple in action. Then it reminds us to always be patient with friends and family, and most importantly, we must have strong compassion towards others as well as towards ourselves. This suggests that you should always strive for simplicity, but more necessary is the idea that you must love and believe in yourself. Because if you don't, then how can you love and believe other people? But Taoism goes beyond that. It also advises us to go with the flow. Does it mean we should never make plans, instead act only spontaneously? Well, no. What it means is that we should never try to change things that are outside of our control. Recognize the things that are in our control. Again, very stoic. Instead, just let them take their natural course. Let things happen. Look at the world as an uncarved stone. By the way, Taoist teaching, but also very Masonic. The idea that we cannot force our will upon it. The stone will be shaped, but if it has a crack in it, if it has a flaw in it, we can't fight it. We need to work with it. And that's very Taoist. So when next you are faced with a dilemma or you have no idea what you need to do, the best decision is possibly to do nothing. To recognize that sometimes inaction is the most appropriate action. However, as soon as you see the right opportunity for a move, you should really take that shot. Taoism also suggests that we cannot live our lives trying to change the people or things around us. We need to accept the nature of what they are and then make the decision whether we can accept that, or if we can't, what we're going to do about it. And that's really powerful, especially in interpersonal relationships. How many of us have sat there and gone, if only the master would do this thing, it would be better. No, that's trying to change the nature of things. Taoism would suggest they're the master. We need to have faith that they know what they're doing, and if they don't, that they will eventually learn. Furthermore, Taoism teaches us to let things go. This philosophy argues that if everything in life is subject to change, would it make any sense to try and hold on to something forever? This doesn't mean throw away all of your stuff or get rid of all of your memories. It means recognize that life is continuous change. If you stand in a river, it's still the Mississippi River, even though the water has shifted and moved downriver. And so if you recognize that, then when that thing is lost, you can put it in perspective and focus on the time that you had with it rather than the loss of the item. When we accept the facts of life, the facts of life and death, the fact of change, it helps us to live a life of freedom. And this freedom is key to having a better life according to Taoism. So if you want to look more into it, one of the basic texts is the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. There's also Essential Taoism by Eva Wong. And there's some basic writings, Zhuangzi, Basic Writings, translated by Burton Watson. There's also a couple of great ones. It was called The Tao of Motorcycle Repair or something along those lines. Came out in the 1970s. It's one way of looking at things. There's also a great, very short book called The Tao of Pooh, as in Winnie the Pooh. And it takes Taoism and boils it down into these characters from Winnie the Pooh, recognizing and kind of describing all of their beliefs and ideas. Very interesting way of looking at it. And I encourage you to look into any of these, even if you disagree with 90% of it. The attentive ear would suggest that we should listen to those things because there might be a lesson somewhere in there that we can use. Finally, I said that we would get into some modern ideas of philosophy, and philosophy shifts a great deal, especially in the 19th and 20th century, to semantic arguments arguments of definition. It becomes very academic and not that applicable oftentimes in life. This is one of the problems that people have with modern philosophy, is these arguments, well, about words more than anything else. But I do want to talk about existentialism, which is probably the most common current philosophy out there. It's kind of dying off for postmodern thought and all of that, but I won't be getting into that too far. And existentialism is all about overcoming nihilism. In other words, overcoming that idea that we exist as some kind of cosmic accident and have no purpose, because that's a very difficult way to live life. So let's take it from the start. Existentialists believe that all humans are bothered by something called existential angst. Effectively, existential angst is this idea of, why do I exist in the first place? So this angst can be seen as that period in our lives when we search for meaning and purpose. That period where we try to know ourselves and how we fit into the grand scheme of the universe. Now, existentialists believe that to find this meaning, we must be willing to become self-aware, create our own values and meanings, and live based on those values, basically creating your own moral framework, creating your own code. Now, this is problematic from a Masonic sense, at least that part of it, because at the end of the day, that would mean that you can create your own ideas rather than living by a larger moral framework, which Masonry would suggest needs to exist so that you can square your actions against something larger than yourself. But let's continue. This suggests that our lives are fully in our hands, and finding meaning and purpose in the world is entirely dependent on us. Existentialists believe that God, government, our parents, teachers, or even friends cannot give us meaning in life except the ones we give ourselves. What then is the first step to finding your purpose? They would believe that this is a journey in finding out who you really are. What are your dreams and aspirations, your deepest fears, your strengths and weaknesses? By finding answers to these questions, you start down a path of finding meaning or purpose in your life. So this is a very personal way of looking at things, very internal looking. You won't see a lot of virtue coming out of this. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche, very depressed German philosopher, great book on Nietzsche, by the way, Hiking with Nietzsche, where this guy goes through and kind of simplifies a lot of his ideas. But Nietzsche writes, in Untimely Meditations, nobody can build you the bridge over which you must cross the river of life. Nobody but you alone. True, there are countless paths and bridges and demigods that would like to carry you across the river, but only at the price of yourself. You would pledge yourself and lose it. In this world, there is one unique path which no one but you may walk. Where does it lead? Do not ask. Simply take it. Now, Nietzsche is a bit of a character, as you may have gotten. He basically argues elsewhere that we must go beyond the simple Christian idea of good and evil, that there is no universal morality, that men are individuals and must be judged as individuals, not within the larger society. That Christianity is a form of morality for the masses, that it is somehow lesser, and refers to it as a slave morality. Basically, this idea that you have to follow Christianity or you don't go to heaven, you don't find paradise, etc. Nietzsche obviously isn't really into the idea of the supreme being, but he has interesting ideas. Just because someone is a fool in some ways, or you may not agree with them in some ways, the attentive ear would suggest that we may find interesting topics, we may find something useful elsewhere. And so I would recommend that at some point you look at these ideas. The richly diverse work of key existential philosophers can be brought together to offer a general picture of what it means to live a good, authentic human life from an existential perspective. It goes a little bit further. I mean, we have people such as in England, we have Mills, J.S. Mill, and we have Hegel coming out of Europe. And these are utilitarians, very similar to existentialism. Basically, the idea that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as it tends to promote the reverse of happiness. So constantly, and that happiness being the person's happiness, being your happiness. So if something brings you happiness, then it must be good. And thus, one of the many problems that you run into in existentialism. And it goes further than that. There's a lot of presuppositions, a lot of arguments that life is to focus on the experience itself and your personal experience, not the experience of the people around you. And this is the major critique of existentialism. While it helps you find a goal and a purpose for existing, it is very internal and doesn't have that selflessness that we tend to see in a lot of philosophies, religions, and ideas in many, many societies. By the way, it does inform a lot of postmodern present thought today. If you're interested in learning more about existentialism, you can look at, for example, what is existentialism? 3 core principles of existentialist philosophy. You can look at Sartre's Waiter, Bad Faith and the Harms of Inauthenticity. Again, the idea of being authentic to yourself. Or Kierkegaard on Finding the Meaning of Life. You can look at, of course, Nietzsche has many, many writings as well. So having looked at these ideas, these 3 ideas, Buddhism, Taoism, existentialism, what I want to do is flip back and look at some common features that we see amongst all of the philosophies that we've dealt with in the last 2 episodes. One of them is acceptance. We see this from the Stoics, from Buddhism, from Taoism, this idea that we have to simply accept what's going on around us to some degree. Yes, if you can change it, go and change it, but it is best to simply accept people for who they show you on a day-to-day basis. If someone is showing you that they aren't a great person or they don't care, whatever, on a regular basis, but on occasion they do act the way that you're hoping, well, is that really the case? Or are you living based on a ghost, a shadow? So, accepting the world for what it is. The idea of letting go, which we see from the Stoics, the Epicureans, Taoism, and Buddhism. This idea of letting go of attachment to things. So your priceless coffee mug with the beautiful square and compass that you got at the centennial of your lodge gets dropped and broken. You should just let it go. Recognize that you had good times with it and then move on, and you will find greater happiness that way. Self-reflection. We see this from Socrates, from the Stoics, again from Buddhism, Taoism. This idea that in order to live a good life, we have to go back and look at the things that we did on the previous day or on that day, maybe in the shower, drive home, whatever, and recognize what we did well, but also recognize where we could change things so that the next time something similar happens, we can make the correct decision. Seeking truth. This is very much, very similar to the idea of acceptance. We see this from the Stoics, Socrates, Buddhism. We see it from Aristotle too, not in the parts that we looked at. And the idea of seeking truth, in other words, seeking the reality of the thing. Looking beyond, for example, on the news, no matter which side you're on, there are talking points and there are arguments that are put out. And seeking truth would suggest that you look at both sides and you go, okay, which one has stronger arguments, which one has weaker arguments, but also which arguments on each side are patently false? Which ones rely entirely on emotion? And so you're looking for that truth constantly questioning your own thoughts, your own feelings, as well as the messages that are coming in from the outside. Now, many of these are outward facing. Aristotle with virtue, the Stoics with virtue, Buddhism, which seeks to address suffering for all, not just suffering for the self in many of their traditions. Taoism, with its ideas of compassion. These tend to be very outward facing. In other words, instead of focusing entirely on myself, I need to make sure that I'm focusing on the people, the things, the beings around me, and trying to alleviate their suffering. Whether it's through acts of virtue, whether it's through loving compassion, whether it's through any other mode. And this becomes really, really powerful because at the end of the day, if I am existing to help others, then that does give me a great deal of purpose. It brings me happiness, but it's a longer lasting contentment rather than the spikes of happiness you might get from focusing inward. Now, that being said, Socrates, with his self-reflection, but also existentialism in a very large way, are inward-facing. And we do see that idea. Most of these philosophies have some idea of reflection, of inward-facing at different times. And we need that. We need that so that we can grow and develop. It's not good enough to just do good works. We also need to consider the works that we do and see if maybe we can do them better. Maybe we can be more effective. Moderation is another common theme, which we see from the Stoics, Buddhism through the Middle Way, Taoism, Epicureanism seeks moderation, even though it seems to be very hedonistic. Moderation in their case, because if you eat a very simple diet and then you have a delicious meal, that meal becomes that much more delicious. It brings you that much more contentment. Ease suffering by questioning desire. This is common from the Stoics and the Buddhists, as well as Taoism. This idea that we need to question the things that we want. How much is that 85-inch TV really going to bring you happiness? Is it going to make you happier than your 60-inch TV? Maybe it will. Okay, maybe for you that is what you do. But you need to question where you're getting these ideas. Am I getting the idea that I need a bigger TV from advertising and Black Friday sales? Or am I getting it because for the last year, I have really come to believe that my 70-inch TV is too little? Now, it may not be the greatest example for easing suffering by questioning desire, but at some point you might look at this and go, well, my 70-inch is actually good enough, and I should be quite happy to have that 70-inch TV and not worry about the 84-inch. Then we have the idea of seeking excellence. We see this from Aristotle, Buddhism, and the Stoics, that you must develop, you must grow, because by growing, you then better serve yourself and you can do more for your family. And if you can do more for your family, they're all in a better position, which means you're doing better for the community and for society overall. Now, there are many commonalities that we see if we compare this to ideas in Masonry. For example, the idea of acceptance. Well, we talk about truth, honor, and fortitude. Truth being a big part of acceptance. Letting go, which we see with fortitude and with temperance, but also looking at the lesson of the common gavel, for example, chipping away the vices and superfluities. By the way, acceptance also comes in Masonically, not just with truth, but also when we talk about prudence, looking at things, reflecting on them, which brings us to self-reflection. We see the application of the working tools. You can only apply the working tools through self-reflection. Also, self-reflection would be prudence. Seeking truth or reality, we see this through truth and honor. These ideas that we must look for that which is reality and recognize those things that are social constructs that don't actually serve our purpose in any great way. Outward-facing ideas. In Masonry, we have the plum, which is entirely outward-facing. You have to compare your actions to something, and the plum would suggest that in your actions, we stand uprightly in our stations before man and God, and therefore we must face outward, because otherwise you don't have a station before man. The idea of brotherly love, relief, truth, honor, fortitude, these are all outward facing. Many of those virtues, many of those ideas are outward facing. And this is powerful because if we're looking outside ourselves, if we're serving others more than we're trying to be self-serving and deal with our own desires, it will bring us that happiness, that contentment that is long-lasting, that thing that people look for so much. Sometimes we look for happiness and not contentment, and that's a problem because happiness is this massive spike, and you can't possibly live there forever. They call it being manic. It's not good. But contentment is a state of mind that you can live in most of the time. But we are also inward facing. Look at the working tools again. Look at the idea of self-reflection, that we have to apply those working tools, we have to look at our actions on a day-to-day basis and grow from them. If you're not growing, then what's the purpose in the first place? We see ideas of moderation, from the circumpunct, a certain point within a circle, from the compass, living within due bounds, the gavel, the 24-inch gauge. And by the way, these are not all of the commonalities. I'm just going at what's coming off the top here. How about easing suffering by questioning desire? Well, the circumpunct would suggest that we do that. Is this within our bounds? Is this something that we should allow our passions to pursue, or does it go too far? Or the compass. Same idea, because that's how we get the circumpunct in the first place. The point creates, well, the point, and the compass draws our circle. Or the gavel. Again, making us question which of our thoughts, which of our ideas, which of our actions are superfluous? Which ones are defined as vices? Which ones can we remove? Seeking excellence. We see this through the Hiramic legend. But also, we see it in the Entered Apprentice. We see it elsewhere. These ideas of needing to pursue something greater than ourselves, and constantly trying to grow and develop, not just morally, not just philosophically, but in a very practical sense, vocationally. In anything we do, we should pursue excellence. We should pursue being that amiable, devout, and exemplary craftsman. So let's draw these two episodes to a bit of a conclusion here, because I've gone on for quite some time. A system of morality is good, and that teaches us how to live a good life, and do many of these philosophies. The difference is a personal philosophy can add to our tool chest, providing ideas we can use to live a good life and discover why we want to do so in the first place. These are all questions that we're going to come across at some point. It could be a midlife crisis. It could simply be an existential crisis. It could be an idea that passes through your mind. But at the end of the day, we want the tools to be able to look into them. And we want to be able to look at all sorts of different ideas in order to answer that question. Don't get tied to one and say, well, I am a Stoic and that's all I do, and just ignore everything else. It doesn't help. Do not walk away from this with the idea that you should adopt a philosophy or one of these. Like I said before, feel free to mix and match. What do I mean by that? Well, think about it. Perhaps a job loss has you feeling hopeless, and Taoism may speak to you. Maybe you have a passive-aggressive coworker, and that has you calling on Stoic ideals and teachings to control your response. You want to use the collected ideas of past great minds, people who literally professionally, for their entire life, dealt with these ideas of what it means to live a good life, and use what they have. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. Look at what's out there. Go beyond the material presented here. Use it as tools or guides to become a better man. And all that's left to say is thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Leakey, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.